From the JAMA Network, this is JAMA Cardiology Author Interviews. Conversations with authors exploring the latest clinical research, reviews, and opinion featured in JAMA Cardiology.
Welcome, everybody, to this podcast from JAMA Cardiology. My name is Dr. Ajay Kirtane. I'm one of the associate editors of JAMA Cardiology, and I'm joined today by three friends and colleagues, Dr. Bobby Yeh from Boston, Dr. Manesh Patel from Durham and Duke, and Dr. David Cohen, also from New York. And we're here to discuss a paper that we're really excited about in the JAMA network on the use of the Impella device. The editorial was also written by two of the people on the podcast today, and we have a great discussion coming up for you. Please excuse the sirens in the background. I apologize about that in advance. We'll launch right into this. We're going to be talking a little bit about the Impella device and observational studies of it. And maybe I'll ask Manesh Patel to start off by summarizing why this is important for clinicians, why this is important for payers. So Manesh, some thoughts on this?
Yeah, thanks, Ajay. I guess I would say first and foremost, congratulations to Bobby and the authors for doing really important work. And why this is such an important question is that every year patients and people with cardiovascular disease have cardiogenic shock, whether it's from a heart attack or from failing hearts. And despite all the advances in cardiovascular medicine, these individuals still have at times up to 40, 50, 60% mortality. As clinicians, we're always struggling in how to help, and many of these individuals can benefit from some of the amazing innovations that have happened to support the heart and the ventricle. And we're going to go into some of those devices. And so as those devices have come forward, a lot of clinicians are looking to best understand how to use this to improve patient outcomes. And so the ways we've been trying to answer that, I think, is a really important question. And how we've done that is really important because the use of these therapies is variable around the world and in the United States, and the outcomes could be variable. And so figuring out the right people to get the right device at the right time is always an important question, and it's even more important when it's in a condition like cardiogenic shock.
I think that's a great summary. And Bobby, you've been so passionate about this, not just from a clinical perspective, but also uniquely from an analytic one. So tell us a little bit about how this project originated, because it's a unique project. It's not just you and your research group, but this was also in conjunction with the FDA. So take us through that and then tell us what you found with the analysis.
Thanks, Ajay. This analysis emerged from conversations that we were having with the FDA. So for several years now, we've worked closely in our group at the Smith Center for Outcomes Research at Beth Israel with the FDA on trying to understand better methods for really interpreting observational data to conduct comparative effectiveness research. We've done some workshops with them in the past. And then right around the 2020, 2021 time period, there were several observational comparative effectiveness studies of the Impella device came out. And the FDA really wasn't sure how to interpret these studies when they came out. These were studies that were published in really top-tier journals. And so they actually called us and they said, we'd like your help with understanding both these studies, and we want to see if we can do some of our own studies in collaboration with you and employ some of these techniques that you've been discussing, some of these traditional techniques like propensity score or regression-based analyses, but as well as other designs, natural experiment type of designs that we were thinking about. And so we came together and really designed a set of studies, a set of analyses together, which are now in this paper in JAMA Cardiology. We really looked at this question of whether or not the Impella device compared to alternative treatments like the Intra-Aortic balloon pump, or even like no mechanical support devices at all, how do they compare to one another for patients presenting with AMI and cardiogenic shock? So the study was really multiple studies in one, I would say. It was multiple approaches to answer this question. And we went about really trying to critically analyze the assumptions embedded in each of these different methodological approaches.
I mean, this is such a fundamentally important question when you read papers where people will look at a paper and they'll look at analysis and say, patients that got one device, how did they do? Patients that got another device or no device, how do they do? And you look at the outcomes together and try to compare them. Now, everybody recognizes that the people that are in one arm may be different than the other, and so you need to make some adjustment to address that. But the question is that adjustment good enough? And are different methods of making that adjustment able to do that analysis in a better way? And that's, Bobby, I think what you really sought out to do. And so tell us what you found.
We looked at this question in 4 different ways, and some of my more epidemiologically minded co-authors would impress upon us that when we look at this question and employ different approaches, we were actually asking different questions when we do so. And so we tried to clarify this in the paper about what we're actually asking when we take different approaches. And what we found when we used several different approaches is that depending on the approach we took, we might find a different answer. So when we took a regression-based or propensity score-based approach, we found consistently that there was an association of the Impella device with worse outcomes compared to any alternatives, intra-aortic balloon pump or no treatment, no mechanical circulatory devices at all. However, there were really hints in the data, and of course there are hints in just our own clinical intuition that this analysis could have been confounded. In the data, we found that those patients who received Impella often had what looked like sicker presentations, higher use of vasopressors, more use of right heart catheterization, which might be indicative of someone who is maybe in a more severe state of shock. And these are factors, importantly, that are not completely measured in the data. We used Medicare administrative data for this. And so these factors like pressor use are not really well captured. You certainly don't capture things like dose, and you might even undercapture whether or not they're being used at all. And so these hints of a greater severity of illness, as well as the data not being fully able to adjust for or capture all the factors that we think guide clinical decision-making, made us very deeply skeptical about the causal interpretability of those analyses that relied on direct comparison with adjustment. Now, sometimes we've taken these approaches and said, well, an alternative is to use these natural experiment designs. And we've done this where we've taken advantage of the fact that sometimes clinicians have these personal preferences of using devices that appear to be sort of random. So we try to use this approach in an instrumental variable approach too to study this. We looked at hospital variation in use. Some hospitals really used Impella quite a bit. Other hospitals didn't use it much at all. And in this analysis where we exploited that instrumental variable, interestingly, we also found an association with worse outcomes with the Impella device. However, when we look at this, we always have to pass the assumption that these hospitals are interchangeable. And we looked at the hospitals that had greater use of Impella versus those that had less use from Impella. We found that these just look like different hospitals that treated different types of patients. And as a result of that, we question again the causal interpretability of that analysis. And then finally, we used an approach where we relied on the fact that some hospitals really have grown in the use of Impella, other hospitals have remained stable over time, and a third set has really declined in the use of Impella over the time. And if you think if the device is really helpful, for example, that those hospitals that used the most over time and grew in use would have an increasingly improved outcomes. And just vice versa, if the device is harmful, then maybe those hospitals that use more and more over time would have worse and worse outcomes. And here we found really null results. The confidence intervals in this analysis, called an instrumented difference in difference analysis, were really wide. And as a result, we really can't, I think, make heads or tails and have a lot of confidence in what the effectiveness of the device is. Really, the results could have been consistent with both benefit or harm.
Well, that's pretty amazing to be able to summarize in a way that everybody could understand. And with that, I'm actually going to ask Dave Cohen, who you, along with Manesh, wrote the editorial. And Dave, in one part of the editorial, you wrote about how there are people that have a lot of clinical experience. There are other people that have a lot of statistical experience. To have both is really what you need sometimes to analyze critically these complex issues. I think you certainly fit into that category. What's your interpretation on this? And what do you think of these findings as a whole now that Bobby has summarized them in that way?
Thanks, Ajay. This is an area that I've been interested in for probably the last 20 years or so and have spent a lot of time thinking about. And I think you already summarized the main finding, which is, as you heard Bobby explain it, you really get a sense of the level of insight that's required in order to interpret these analyses correctly, to design them correctly. And I think it really points out one of the major benefits of randomized clinical trials, which is, frankly, they're much easier to analyze in many ways. They're hard to conduct. They take a lot of work and infrastructure and those sorts of things. But once you get to the end of a randomized clinical trial, all you do is have group A, group B, and you count up the bodies or the events, run some statistical software, and you have a pretty clear answer. It may be positive, it may be negative, but it's very easy for everyone to interpret. It just makes sense. These sorts of analyses, the one that Bobby has described and his group has really excelled at in this study, have the opposite attributes. That is, they're easier in some ways to conduct because they take advantage of existing data, but the analytic complexity is far greater. And even more than that, their interpretation is much more challenging. And as you alluded to, what really is required is not just statistical insight to run the software, but a high degree of clinical insight in order to understand those factors that drive the decision-making. In these types of observational analyses, the patients are not randomly assigned to different treatments. The treatments are being decided by their clinicians, and we have to have some way of accounting for the differences between those factors. And very often, they're not intuitively obvious to an outside observer who's not a specialist in the clinical area. So again, thinking of a statistician or epidemiologist, they may understand the mathematics that underlie the analysis and understand the theoretical benefits and limitations of the approach. But in order to really look at the data and understand where those landmines lie and how one might overcome them, you really need, to some degree, people whose expertise spans both parts of the spectrum, that they have the clinical insight in order to understand what is driving decision-making and is the approach accounting for those driving factors, and then have the analytic expertise either within themselves or with close collaborators who have particular expertise in these methods in order to apply them correctly to the data set. And I think that's one of our main challenges, is building that repertoire. And it's really one of the strengths of Bobby's group at the Smith Center have brought to bear on this by, again, marrying together clinical experts, methodologic experts, and people who span both.
Before we go to the big picture clinically on this, because I think we do want to bring it back to that point, Bobby, I think it's safe to say that all the carefully done analyses that you did, really there was no analysis that demonstrated benefit. There were a couple that demonstrated harm, but even those were the ones that showed null effect. It's difficult to rely upon these results using this specific database, this Medicare database, which is not granular. But it's not fair to say that there's no way an observational analysis could be informative, right? I mean, tell us a little bit about your feelings on that, because I know that's something that we discussed quite a bit when we were discussing the paper and what its goals were and ultimately what its interpretation was.
I think it would be a mistake to interpret our study as showing that observational comparisons can never be done. I've heard that statement be made before, and it's an overgeneralization. Certainly in this particular case, with this particular question in this particular data set, for many reasons, I think that we couldn't do a credible observational comparison. Now, the reasons for that were that the data set are not sufficiently granular, as well as the clinical decision-making is such that the treatment decision here is so strongly driven by prognostic patient factors that is one of these examples where there are questions that are just going to be intractably confounded. And I think this is one of them. Many clinicians are using these devices as the last resort for a patient who's about to potentially pass away. And in that situation, it creates the conditions for confounding. So unfortunately, I think this particular question in currently available data are not really possible to answer. And in fact, I might argue that there is really no observational data set that I could even envision that could sufficiently capture the nuanced clinical decision-making, which will allow for a comparison like this. There are other decisions that I can think of that clinicians make all the time that the data sets would be sufficient to be able to capture those clinical decisions. But in this particular one, I think it's really an uphill climb.
That's a great summary. And Manesh, I'm going to go to you, because despite the fact of what was just said, I think every week we see a comparative analysis, if not of this device, of similar comparisons. And we also, by the way, know with this specific device that there are many clinicians who feel passionately that they're saving lives by using the device. And yet the data to support that assertion, which can be a visceral one at many times when you have a dying patient in front of you, the data to support that, it appears that there's a null effect or even potentially the other direction. So how do we get ourselves out of this situation? What's the next step? And is that a fair statement that I made? What are your thoughts on this?
I think the way that Bobby highlighted it is really well done, which is, there's the granularity of the data and then the decision that we're trying to make. And let me just say, do I think these devices work? Yes, I know of situations and clinical scenarios where I've felt like that this device, having used the device, works. My big concern is I'm just not sure I know in which patients all the time and when I should be deploying it. And that's something quite interesting to be saying this far into any of these devices in cardiogenic shock. David and I talked a lot about this as we looked at the masterful analysis, as Bobby just highlighted. With the FDA and others, they did really multiple levels to show this. And as you highlighted, I don't know that you can use any of the data because of the granularity to show benefit, and in some ways it shows harm. In fact, some would say one of the values of observational data is sometimes it shows you a signal and a possibility of harm where you might be thinking you're helping. So one of the things we at least talked about is that remembering the data set that Bobby used, a lot of other individuals have access to, and they're not as nuanced in at least doing the analysis or coming to conclusions. So that just leads to more confusion. And finally, there's a lot of people with cardiogenic shock and clinicians caring for them that want this. So, how did we get here? Who's to blame? I guess I would say a little bit of all of us, and what are the ways that we can work better? And this is part of the editorial and thinking about how can we continue to build a system for evidence generation for novel cardiovascular devices. we want to support innovation. We need to have reimbursement for it. So some of the things David can speak to too is we spoke about coverage with evidence generation. So once you have a signal that something might work, if you gave the type of reimbursement that's going on with these devices to the sites to do randomized trials, I think early on you would have had a lot of sites interested in that procedural process. And I think you could have had a lot of ways to do this. Maybe cardiogenic shock might not have been the first spot, but there'll be others to get there. And I do think building a network that does coverage with evidence generation and encouraging equipoise to do those trials is really meaningful. At least I'll start with that, recognizing that not any one of our sites or own clinical practices can always randomize all of our patients. For things like this, we certainly need continued work to build that infrastructure.
I think that's a great summary. I would say I agree with you in the sense that if there are analyses that can at least reintroduce the notion of equipoise here, because certainly 5 years ago, for many people, there was no equipoise. It's impossible to do a randomized trial. But yet, when you have analyses like these and others that potentially reintroduce that, then that allows randomization to occur within a trial. David, maybe some final quick summary points that you had. I want to throw it back to Bobby in case there was something we missed before we conclude.
I believe, like Bobby, that there are circumstances, specific clinical situations and specific devices where observational methods similar to the ones that Bobby's group used in this study can be used to truly provide causal answers, provide insight that is of similar quality to what one could get with a randomized trial. And we've collaborated with Bobby and his team on several of these over the years where the situation, to me, seems much clearer. For example, we published a study a couple of years ago looking at cerebral embolic protection for transcatheter aortic valve replacement that used one of these quasi-experimental designs, the instrumental variable approach, and felt that that provided very robust findings and ones that would support a causal interpretation. And of note, this was 2 years before the protected TAVR randomized trial was published, and our results parallel that exactly. We found no difference, a weak trend towards a reduction in stroke with cerebral embolic protection. We felt at the time was probably warranted a causal interpretation. And then 2 years later, the randomized trial came out and justified that. So one of our challenges is in being able to identify those circumstances before we start. Can we identify which are the decisions where the confounding can be handled with some of these quasi-experimental designs, and educating all of our colleagues to understand when those are present versus when they aren't. I think that is something which really is an important skill set and something we should be focusing on. The second, I just do want to reemphasize what Manesh said, is that we do have part of the issue in this particular circumstance, and why we don't have the answers is because the devices were approved prior to generating any strong evidence of benefit. And certainly in the case of cardiogenic shock, there were simply no trials whatsoever. And to some degree, we missed the opportunity to really test those in a rigorous fashion. The studies are only getting off the ground now to try to do this. But the opportunity back 7-8 years ago when Impella was initially approved, to have a payer like Medicare say, we'll be happy to pay for this device in the context of an appropriate randomized trial to demonstrate whether there's really benefit or not, really is a missed opportunity. And I think that we actually sort of need help from some of the payers to help us do what's the right thing to get these treatments evaluated quickly so that we can have the answer and not be lingering for a decade without really knowing the truth.
Bobby, any final comments? Anything we missed?
I do really want to thank the FDA. We're really very interested in this and engaged in this in the whole process, as well as my co-authors, Zaid Al-Marzouk and others. One thing that extends beyond this study is we weren't shy about the fact that we had a causal intent to this study. The goal of this study was to study whether or not Impella was as effective, more effective, less effective than other devices. In today's literature, too many times we shy away from the true intent of our observational studies. We use this language of association instead of causality. We're sort of asked to do that. And I think that takes all of us off the hook for trying to prove our causal case. In this case, we didn't prove our causal case. We actually shied away from it. What we shouldn't do is shy away from the fact that we do have a causal intent to many of these studies and then prove whether or not we've been convincing in establishing that case.
Well, with that, that's a great way to conclude. It certainly opens a door for future research. The only downside of that is there are definitely times when people will do an observational analysis, not check for the flaws, and then conclude causality as a result of it. And we definitely don't want to encourage that. It's been a great podcast. I really want to thank Bobby, you, also Manesh and Dave, not only for this, but other conversations that have led up to this point. This was an episode produced by Shelley Steffens at the JAMA Network. To follow this and other JAMA Network podcasts, please visit us online at jamanetworkaudio.com. Thanks so much for listening, everybody.